where without me, she'd be living on the streets right now. My father sat in the witness box, arrogantly adjusting his expensive custom silk tie, a smug smirk plastered across his face. The judge looked down at the legal documents spread before her, then turned to look at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "So they genuinely have no idea?" the judge asked. My father's high-priced Los Angeles defense attorney frowned, squaring his shoulders. "Have no idea about what, Your Honor?" The judge let out a heavy sigh. "The fact that she is the actual owner of the holding company that currently holds all your mortgages." I watched in total silence as every single drop of color drained from my father's face. "My name is Victoria. I'm 35 years old, and I just used the full weight of the legal system to evict my entire family from our ancestral estate. Before we dive into how we got here, let me know in the comments where you are listening from today, and if you've ever had to stand tall against toxic family members who constantly underestimated your worth, please hit that like button and subscribe. The civil courtroom of the San Francisco Federal District Court was designed to intimidate. The towering walnut-paneled walls and the echoing marble floors definitely did the trick. But the chill in that massive room was nothing compared to the absolute coldness radiating from the witness stand. Richard Sterling, my father, sat there looking like the undisputed king of Silicon Valley venture capital. Wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than most people make in several months, he exuded the exact same arrogance that had terrorized our household for decades. We were here because he had filed an emergency eviction order against me. He wanted the marshals to forcibly remove me from the Atherton estate, a historic property in the most expensive zip code of Silicon Valley, and the place my late mother loved more than anywhere else. For years I had lived quietly in the guest cottage, while the rest of the family treated me like a parasitic stain on their picture-perfect elite image. Gideon, my father's aggressively hostile and insanely expensive powerhouse attorney, paced in front of the witness stand. He was a man who thoroughly enjoyed the sound of his own voice, and right now he was painting a fictional masterpiece for the court. "But tell us, Mr. Sterling," Gideon prompted, his tone dripping with practiced sympathy. "Why were we forced to take such drastic legal measures against your own flesh and blood today?" My father let out a sigh, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of a weary, heartbroken parent. "I love my daughter, Your Honor," he said, looking earnestly at Judge Rosalind. "But there comes a point where tough love is the only option left for a father. Out of pure charity, I allowed her to stay in the guest cottage on the Atherton estate. I truly hoped she would use that time to get her life back on track. Instead, she has overstayed her welcome like a squatter on my $25 million property. She refuses to leave, refuses to contribute a single dime, and is essentially holding my future venture fund restructuring hostage. To put it bluntly, she wants a free ride." Gideon nodded solemnly, as if listening to a profound tragedy. "And does she have the financial means to find her own accommodation?" My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet courtroom. "On her pathetic IT customer support salary? Absolutely not. She answers phones for a living, troubleshooting basic tech problems. She could barely afford a studio apartment in the worst neighborhood in Oakland, let alone maintain an estate as massive as Atherton." I didn't react. I sat perfectly composed next to my own attorney, hands folded neatly in my lap. In the gallery behind me, I could hear my younger brother Julian and his wife, Chloe, letting out suppressed, condescending chuckles. They had shown up just to watch the spectacle. Julian, 32, was the golden boy of the family and the CEO of a cryptocurrency startup. He was decked out in high-end streetwear bought with my father's venture capital money. Next to him was Chloe, a superficial influencer who treated charity galas like personal runways. They were here to witness the family scapegoat finally get thrown out into the freezing San Francisco wind. They thought I spent my days wearing a cheap plastic headset, apologizing to angry customers on the phone. They had absolutely no idea that the call center I claimed to work at was actually the compliance desk for Aegis Nexus, a powerhouse cybersecurity and distressed asset acquisition firm that I built completely from scratch. They didn't know that while they were blowing through money that wasn't theirs, I was quietly buying up the debts of the very people they clinked glasses with at the country club. Judge Rosalind narrowed her eyes, peering over the rim of her reading glasses at the witness stand. Mr. Sterling, if your daughter's financial situation was as dire as you claim, why did you cut off her trust fund 10 years ago? It was a standard background question, but my father took it as an opportunity to inflate his ego. Because I refuse to finance rebellion, Your Honour, he said, tilting his chin up proudly. 10 years ago, I arranged a highly advantageous marriage for Victoria. The son of my primary business partner was a respectable, wealthy tech entrepreneur. The union would have secured her future and consolidated my venture empire's legacy. But Victoria refused. She thought she was too good for traditional family obligations. She walked away from her responsibilities, so I cut her off completely to teach her a harsh lesson about reality. I listened to him dismiss all my trauma as mere teenage rebellion. He conveniently left out the fact that the business partner's son was a violently controlling individual, and that the forced marriage was nothing more than a financial transaction to bail my father out of a terrible venture deal. He hid the fact that his suffocating control had caused me severe panic attacks, nearly breaking me completely until I found the courage to escape his grasp. He believed my escape led to my poverty. He thought cutting me off had forced me into a miserable existence of living paycheck to paycheck on minimum wage. Gideon turned back to the judge, dramatically waving a piece of paper in the air. As you can see, Your Honour, my client is the sole owner of the Atherton estate. We served a 3-day notice to quit in full accordance with California law. The defendant ignored it completely. We asked the court to grant the eviction order today and dispatch the county sheriff to remove her personal property immediately. Judge Rosalind took the documents from the bailiff, reviewed them carefully, and then looked directly across the courtroom at me. Her expression was incredibly sharp, completely unreadable. Mrs. Sterling, her voice cut through the heavy silence of the room, your father claims you are a non-paying guest who refuses to vacate his property. You have heard his testimony regarding your financial situation in this eviction notice. What defence do you have to present to this court today? I looked at the piece of paper currently projected on the courtroom display screen. It was a document I knew all too well, the very one that had triggered this full-scale war. I didn't look at the judge. Instead, I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with my father on the witness stand. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. To understand how we ended up in this echoing courtroom, and why my arrogant father here had absolutely no idea he had just walked into a catastrophic trap, we have to rewind. We have to go back exactly 7 days. Back to the Sterling family's lavish 4th of July barbecue, which was precisely where the first shot of this war was fired, and where they hand-delivered the matches I would use to bring down their entire fake empire. The terrace of the Atherton estate was sweltering under the July sun, the air thick with the scent of high-end Wagyu beef, expensive sunblock, and undercurrents of resentment. Crystal wine glasses caught the glare of the sun as Silicon Valley tech elites and venture capitalists mingled on the lawn. It was a perfect picture of California old money blending with tech wealth. But beneath the surface, the Sterling family was rotting from within. My father, Richard, sat at the head of a custom outdoor long table, looking like a feudal lord surveying his domain. To his right sat my brother, Julian, wearing a casual designer linen shirt and sporting a Richard Miller watch that I knew with absolute certainty was financed through my father's corporate credit lines. Next to him was his wife, Chloe, busy taking selfies with the latest smartphone, pretending her non-profit environmental organization was actually doing real work. And there I was, sitting at the very end of the long table, the designated family outcast. The daughter who had supposedly ruined her life 10 years ago by refusing to marry my father's business partner. During the first half of the party, they played their usual games. Julian complained about server scaling issues at his cryptocurrency exchange, hinting that father should allocate a few more million from the venture fund. Chloe chimed in, tossing out flashy Silicon Valley buzzwords to ensure my father remembered how valuable it was to have an influential daughter-in-law. They ignored me completely, treating me like a hired servant who had accidentally sat down at their banquet. I quietly ate the food on my plate, watching their pathetic display of wealth. I knew exactly how deep in debt my father was. I knew exactly how much capital Julian's crypto firm was losing, but they thought I was completely oblivious. They believed I spent my days answering calls from angry users at a tech support center. Then my father decided it was time for the main event. Richard wiped his mouth slowly with an expensive linen napkin. He reached into the inner pocket of his custom blazer, pulled out a thick folded legal document, and slid it directly down the table. It landed with a dull thud right in front of my plate, the edge of the heavy parchment catching a smudge of barbecue sauce. I looked down at the bold black letters printed at the top. Notice of waiver of trust rights and 3-day eviction. A sharp, cruel chuckle broke the artificial pleasantry of the table. Chloe covered her perfectly manicured hand over her mouth, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. She looked at my father with absolute adoration. "You've overstayed your welcome, Victoria," my father said, his voice cold and flat. His sharp eyes locked onto me, devoid of any parental warmth. "You contribute nothing to this family. You refuse to follow my rules, yet you live like a parasite in the guest cottage of my house. In order to fund Julian's new AI project, I need to fully liquidate the estate's trust assets. You have 72 hours to pack up your junk and get off my land." Julian leaned back in his comfortable outdoor wicker chair, swirling $100 bourbon in his glass. He adopted his most condescending tech CEO posture. "Let's be objective, Victoria," Julian said, looking at me with undisguised pity. In the real Silicon Valley, a 35-year-old woman with no stock options and no husband doesn't get to live for free on a $25 million estate. You had plenty of time to find a real career, but you chose laziness. You chose to be a minimum wage operator. Julian pulled a sleek metal wallet from his pocket. He slid a crisp $500 bill across the polished teak tabletop. It stopped right next to the sauce-stained eviction notice. "Take it," Julian said, his voice dripping with fake generosity. "Consider it a charitable donation from me as a CEO. You can use it to rent a U-Haul truck and find a basement apartment in some rundown neighborhood in the East Bay. After all, I worked my tail off to get where I am today. I know the value of hard work, which is clearly something you never learned." Chloe placed her hand proudly on her husband's arm, chiming in. "Julian is being incredibly generous, Vicky. You should thank him. Dad let you live off him for 10 years. It's time for you to grow up and face reality." They sat there, a united front of arrogance and privilege. A father drowning in leveraged debt. A brother living a total lie. A sister-in-law who thought her follower count gave her the right to step on me to elevate her own status. Tamankawa saw way to tonku wei shi. They fed on my supposed misery. They expected me to break. They expected me to burst into tears, beg my father for more time, and swear I would be a better, more obedient daughter. They wanted to enjoy the thrill of watching the family scapegoat have a mental breakdown right in front of them. I looked at the eviction notice sitting next to my food. I looked at the $500 on the table.
Then I did the one thing none of them expected. I laughed.
I picked up the eviction notice, carefully wiped the sauce off the corner with my napkin, and placed it neatly next to my water glass. I ignored the cash completely. I picked up my fork, took a slow bite of my salad, and chewed calmly. The atmosphere on the terrace turned heavy and incredibly uncomfortable. The triumphant smiles on their faces began to waver. They were waiting for a meltdown that was never going to come. I swallowed my food, took a sip of water, and finally looked my father dead in the eye. My voice was perfectly calm, smooth, and completely stripped of any emotion. "Here you are liquidating your physical assets to cover your margin calls," I stated flatly. The air froze instantly. My father's confident posture stiffened. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by the financial terminology coming out of my mouth. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. "Which means that Sterling Ventures' Series C funding round has completely collapsed." Richard's smug smile vanished. A flash of pure panic crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with anger. "What nonsense are you babbling about?" he snapped, his voice suddenly defensive. "That funding project is the core of my quarter."
"No, it isn't," I replied, my tone as casual as if I were discussing the weather. "That project has been dead in the water for 6 months due to a catastrophic capital shortfall. You failed to secure a bridge loan from secondary lenders, and last Tuesday, The primary contractor pulled out of your San Jose office development because your checks bounced. You're trying to liquidate this estate because you are bleeding cash, and the banks are preparing to call in your loans.
My father's face turned the colour of wet ash. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned white. Julian completely stopped swirling his whiskey, his CEO mask evaporating into pure confusion. Chloe looked back and forth between her husband and her father-in-law, utterly lost, unable to comprehend why the atmosphere had suddenly taken such a chilling turn. I raised my glass, took a leisurely sip, and stared at my father's terrified gaze over the rim of the crystal. The question hung heavily in the suffocating air. How could the family failure, the woman who supposedly answered phones for minimum wage, know the highly confidential, deeply buried financial secrets of his supposedly invincible venture empire? My father's silence was deafening. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant flush completely drained from his cheeks. For 10 years he had controlled the narrative. He was the infallible Silicon Valley tycoon, and I was the unstable, ungrateful daughter. Now, I had just casually dismantled his entire financial disguise in between bites of salad. Before Richard could formulate a lie to save face, Julian slammed his crystal glass onto the table. The sharp crack of glass against wood shattered the tension. Julian stood up, adjusting his expensive shirt. He couldn't stand to see another man, especially his wealthy father, lose the upper hand. More importantly, Julian couldn't handle a woman challenging his authority. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Victoria," Julian said in his deep, booming boardroom voice, the one he used to intimidate junior programmers. "I don't know what kind of cheap internet searches you ran from your little cubicle at that pathetic call centre, but making defamatory allegations against the Sterling Venture Empire is enough for us to file a massive slander lawsuit against you." I locked my eyes onto Julian. Public records and bounce checks in the hands of angry contractors aren't slander, Julian. They are facts. Julian pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. "You listen to me. You're not just dealing with an annoyed landlord anymore. You're dealing with my personal legal team. I'll handle this for Richard free of charge, because removing a toxic parasite from this family is a personal favour I will gladly perform. We aren't just going to evict you," Julian continued, leaning across the table like a predator closing in on its prey. "If you force our hand and drag this in front of a judge, I swear I will personally subpoena your entire medical history. Every single therapy record, every psychiatric evaluation, every prescription note written for you since you turned 25. The air instantly grew heavy. They were going straight for the throat, weaponizing my darkest past. "We all know you're not well, Victoria." Julian lowered his voice, adopting a sickeningly fake tone of concern. "We all remember what you were like in your 20s. We remember the severe panic attacks. We remember you collapsing on the floor, unable to move. We remember the months you couldn't even leave your bedroom, let alone hold down a job or manage a bank account." Chloe eagerly joined the fray, emboldened by her husband's aggressive tactics. She rested her chin on her hands, looking at me with wide, mock-sympathetic eyes. "It's for your own good, Vicky. You're clearly having another episode, fabricating these wild delusions about Dad going bankrupt. You've completely lost touch with reality. You need real help, maybe a facility." Julian nodded firmly. "Exactly. When I present your extensive history of severe mental instability to a judge, this won't just be an eviction hearing. I will petition the court to declare you legally and financially incompetent. I will request that Richard be appointed as your permanent legal guardian. You won't even have the right to open a checking account without his signature. You will lose every shred of autonomy you think you have. If this had been 10 years ago, their threat would have utterly destroyed me. 10 years ago, the mere mention of my anxiety would have sent me straight into a panic attack, right there in my chair. They knew that. They relied on it. My family had always used my mental health as a leash to keep me compliant. They thought my anxiety made me weak. They had no idea that surviving that darkness was exactly what had forged my mind into hardened steel. I didn't break my calm mask. I didn't flinch. I slowly reached out, picked up my water, and took a sip. I looked at Julian. He was waiting for my surrender. He was waiting for my tears. Your cryptocurrency exchange has been making a lot of headlines recently, Julian, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly controlled. I hear you just announced a massive expansion and restructuring. The rumour around the valley is that you're preparing to completely dilute the founding team's shares by bringing in private equity from Wall Street. I assume a CEO as brilliant and indispensable as yourself is perfectly secure in this upcoming reorganisation. Usually, when private equity moves into a cash-burning tech company, executives who like to misappropriate corporate funds to buy sports cars are the first to be purged to cut costs. But I'm sure you have absolutely nothing to worry about. Julian's face went completely white. The colour drained from his face so fast he looked like he was about to pass out. The negotiations regarding his company facing a hostile takeover were strictly confidential. It was a closed-door secret, limited only to senior partners. There was absolutely no way anyone outside the loop could know anything about the restructuring.
He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, all his alpha male bravado stripped away.
How do you know about that? Julian demanded, his voice cracking. Who told you? I stood up from the table, smoothing the wrinkles on my skirt. I ignored his panic entirely. I looked down at my father, who was still silently gripping the edge of the table. I won't be signing your eviction notice, Richard. See you in court. Without another word, I turned my back on the stunned silence on the terrace. I walked through the grand living room, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble, pushed open the heavy front door, and stepped out into the cool evening air of the San Francisco Bay Area. The ocean breeze hit my face, but I had never felt warmer. As soon as I was back inside my unassuming sedan, I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I scrolled through an encrypted contact list and hit dial. It rang exactly once before a voice answered. "Good evening, Ms. Sterling," my chief operating officer said, his voice crisp and professional. "Marcus," I said, staring up at the towering silhouette of the Atherton estate. "The wait is over. Activate the portfolio initiative. I want Aegis Nexus to immediately acquire all defaulted commercial loans tied to Richard Sterling. Also, find the hidden secondary mortgage on this estate. By Monday morning, I want to own his entire life." Marcus didn't hesitate. There was a brief pause on the line, the faint echo of rapid keyboard typing, and then his sharp voice returned. "Consider it done, Ms. Sterling. I'm pulling up Richard Sterling's corporate portfolio right now. It's a complete disaster. He is over-leveraged on 5 commercial real estate projects across both coasts, and his primary lenders have already classified the notes as non-performing. We can snap up this debt through our distressed asset division at a massive discount." I wrapped my coat a bit tighter around myself. The July evening wind swept across the estate's sweeping lawns, chilling my skin, but my mind was firing with absolute precision. "Buy it all, Marcus. I don't care about the cost. I want his commercial notes, the equipment leases on his venture firm, and the deed to every single square inch of land under his name. I especially want that hidden loan he took out against Atherton. He forged Julian and Chloe's signatures as guarantors to secure it, and I want that paperwork sitting safely in my private vault before the banks open on Monday." I paced along the cold driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my heels. For a decade, my father had sold the world a myth of unparalleled success. He hosted charity dinners, drove imported sports cars, and belittled anyone who didn't meet his false standards of wealth. He built an empire on smoke and mirrors, using quietly accumulated debt to fund his arrogant lifestyle. For 10 years he used my mental health as a convenient smokescreen, pointing to his broken daughter so no one would look too closely at his fractured ledger.
Now he had forced my hand. He thought that eviction notice was the ultimate show of power. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his kingdom.
Marcus rattled off a few more financial figures, confirming the rapid acquisition agreements that would allow Aegis Nexus to sweep up my father's debt overnight. "We are moving completely under the radar," Marcus assured me. "He won't even know his loans have changed hands until the foreclosure notices hit his desk." As Marcus was speaking, the phone pressed to my ear vibrated violently. A text notification popped up on the screen. It was an iMessage from Julian. I pulled the phone away, keeping Marcus on speaker, and tapped open the message. It was a 10-second video file. I pressed play. The shaky vertical footage unfolded inside the guest cottage, where I had spent the last few weeks. Chloe was filming, her high-pitched mocking laughter serving as the soundtrack. The camera panned to reveal my father and Julian standing in front of my open closet. "Looks like our squatter forgot to pack," my father said roughly in the video, his face flushed with a triumphant glow. He reached into the closet, grabbed a handful of my clothes, and violently ripped the hangers off the rod. Julian stepped forward, rolling up his sleeves, eager to play the dutiful Silicon Valley enforcer. "Let me help with that, Richard. Let's take out the trash." Julian grabbed my heavy cashmere coat, the one I had bought specifically for business trips to the East Coast. He strode over to the large French windows. They were flung open. With a loud, arrogant grunt, Julian hurled my coat out of the second-story window. My father followed closely behind, dumping a stack of my professional suits into the dark night. Chloe tilted the camera down toward the driveway, capturing the image of my belongings, landing in the muddy water caused by the automated sprinkler system below. The video ended with Chloe flipping the camera to face herself, flashing a brilliant smile. "Have fun at the motel, loser," she chirped cheerfully before the screen went black. I stood on the driveway, looking down at the pile of clothes scattered across the wet pavement just a few yards away. The cashmere coat was already soaked with muddy water from a nearby puddle. Any normal person would have screamed. A younger version of me, the fragile 25-year-old girl they loved to torment, would have fallen to her knees in that puddle, sobbing and begging them to stop. They sent that video expecting to trigger a panic attack. They wanted to break me completely, but I didn't feel a single shred of panic. What I felt was an overwhelming, crystal-clear calm. The very last trace of familial obligation I held in my heart vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, precise calculations of a corporate executioner. "Are you still there, Ms. Sterling?" Marcus asked over the speakerphone, his voice cutting through the quiet summer night. "I'm here, Marcus," I replied, my voice dangerously level. I looked up at the second-story windows, where I could see the moving silhouettes of my father and brother, no doubt celebrating their cruel little victory. "Did something happen?" he asked, picking up on the shift in my tone. "Do we need to contact local law enforcement for illegal eviction or property damage?" I stepped over my ruined cashmere coat, ignoring the cold, muddy water seeping into my shoes. "No. Involving the police is a temporary inconvenience. I want absolute ruin. I need you to pivot, Marcus. I want you to pull up the corporate filings for a Silicon Valley cryptocurrency infrastructure provider." I gave him the name, Apex Core Servers. Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard. Apex Core, a mid-sized server hosting farm. They have a solid reputation in the sector, but I'm seeing red flags in their recent quarterly filings. They overextended on commercial leases and are relying heavily on revolving credit lines to stay afloat. Why are we looking at a mid-sized server company? Because my arrogant younger brother happens to be their largest client, and his entire cryptocurrency exchange is hosted on their physical servers, I explained, walking slowly back to my car. He just threw my coat out of a window because he believes his CEO title makes him untouchable. He thinks hiding behind a fancy desk and funding numbers protects him. I'm going to cure him of his delusion. I opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and shut out the wind. Apex Core is in quiet acquisition talks with Wall Street to avoid insolvency, I told Marcus, recalling Julian's terrified expression at dinner. They are vulnerable. They are desperate for capital. I want Aegis Nexus to buy out their entire revolving credit line immediately. I want the master lease on the corporate offices and the facilities where their servers are housed. Marcus let out a low whistle. A hostile takeover of an infrastructure provider's operational debt? That is highly aggressive, Ms. Sterling. It effectively means we become their shadow board. We'll hold the leverage to dictate their internal restructuring. It is exactly the point, I said, shifting the car into drive. By Monday morning, I want absolute control over their managing partners. I want the power to decide who stays, who goes, and whose network cable gets pulled. Julian thinks he can use his platform to crush me. Let's see how tough he acts when he realizes I hold the power plug to his servers. I backed out of the driveway, my headlights sweeping over the discarded pile of clothes in the mud. I didn't look back at the house. I had set everything in motion. When the sun rose on Monday, my family would wake up in a world entirely owned by the daughter they had thrown away. The brass bell above the glass door of an upscale private club cafe in San Francisco let out a crisp, musical chime, cutting through the low hum of Monday morning rush hour. The air was thick with the rich aroma of deeply roasted espresso beans and baked pastries. I sat at a small, scratched wooden table in the corner, my laptop open in front of me. To anyone passing by, I looked like a typical Silicon Valley remote worker, dressed in a simple beige turtleneck, typing intently into a spreadsheet. But I wasn't just typing. I was watching my dashboard light up as Aegis Nexus executed the hostile acquisitions I had authorized 72 hours prior. A shadow fell over my screen. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The sharp, expensive scent of his cologne announced him before he even spoke. Julian pulled out the metal chair across from me and sat down without asking. He was wearing a brand new charcoal grey pinstripe suit, his silk tie knotted in a perfect Windsor. He slammed his initialed leather briefcase onto the table, rudely pushing my coffee cup aside to make room for his ego. "Is this where the tech support magic happens?" Julian asked, flashing a condescending smile that revealed his blindingly artificial veneers. He glanced around the bustling cafe, his nose wrinkling slightly, as if sharing a room with regular, hard-working people was an offence to his status. "I guess it beats freezing outside with the rest of your trash." I slowly closed my laptop, folding my hands neatly on top of it. "What do you want, Julian?" He chuckled, unclasping his briefcase with a sharp click. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Victoria. We both know you're backed into a corner. You have no money, no home, and absolutely zero leverage. But Richard is a generous man. He's willing to offer you a clean break." Julian pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and dropped it onto the table. It slid across the wood, coming to a stop right in front of my laptop. Inside that envelope is a non-disclosure agreement and a cashier's check for $5,000. Julian stated, leaning back and crossing his arms. "In exchange for this generous parting gift, you will sign over your rights to any remaining trust shares from our late mother's estate, specifically her collection of vintage Bulgari and Cartier jewellery." I stared at the envelope. The jewellery was the very last untouched asset in the Sterling family trust. My father had been unable to liquidate it because it required the signatures of both his children. He was so desperate for cash to cover his failing commercial loans that he had sent his corporate attack dog to bully me into giving up my half of the inheritance for a mere $5,000. "And if I refuse to sign?" I asked, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table. The smugness vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, aggressive legal threat. "If you refuse, Victoria, I will personally ensure you never recover. Richard has already retained a top-tier litigation team. I will bury you under so many frivolous lawsuits that you'll spend every single day of your miserable life in a courtroom." I watched a barista steam milk on the other side of the cafe, letting the silence stretch between us. "I will sue you for property damage to the Atherton estate," Julian continued, dropping his voice to ensure the surrounding tables couldn't hear his extortion. "I will drag your credit score so low you won't even be able to rent a cardboard box in the worst alley in San Francisco. And if you try to fight back, I will subpoena your complete medical history, every therapy session, every psychiatric evaluation from your breakdown in your 20s. I will have a judge declare you financially and legally incompetent and hand full guardianship over to your father." "Tournay, you would actually weaponize my medical history just to please Richard?" I asked softly. Julian let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. "You have no idea how the real world works, do you? You grew up in a mansion with a silver spoon and threw it all away to play the tragic rebel. You disgust me." He jabbed his index finger into the table, his face flushing with sudden intense anger. "I didn't have your privileges. I had to scratch and claw to get my company to its current valuation. I gave up everything to sit with the elite, and I earned my spot at Richard Sterling's table. I'm building an empire with Chloe, and I am absolutely not letting a lazy, ungrateful dropout ruin my father-in-law's legacy. You sign that document right now, take the $5,000, and disappear." He slid a silver pen across the table. It rolled up to my hand. "Sign it, Victoria. Right now." I didn't pick up the pen. I didn't look at the envelope. I reached for my ceramic coffee cup, brought it to my lips, and took a slow sip. It was lukewarm, but it tasted like victory. I set the cup down, my eyes locking directly into his. Julian was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath his custom suit as he waited for me to break. He was waiting for the scared, anxious girl from 10 years ago to emerge and beg for mercy. Instead, I unclipped a small, understated leather portfolio sitting next to my laptop. I reached inside and pulled out a fresh document printed on heavy cardstock. I slid it across the table. It landed perfectly on top of his non-disclosure agreement. Julian frowned, a crease of confusion forming between his brows. He looked down at the paper. At the very top of the page, printed in a sharp modern typeface, was a logo, a solid black geometric diamond. "What is this?" Julian muttered, his eyes darting across the dense legal text of the document. "That is an internal corporate memorandum, Julian," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. "It was generated exactly 14 minutes ago. If you check your corporate email right now, you'll find a digital copy already sitting in your inbox." Julian's eyes scanned the page frantically. I watched the arrogant flush drain from his cheeks, replaced by the same pale, fearful grey he had shown at the barbecue. "As you so vividly just pointed out," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You worked very hard for your cryptocurrency exchange. It does indeed have decent traffic, but unfortunately, it has been plagued by massive operational debt and non-compliant server costs for the past 3 quarters. Your executives have been desperately trying to force a merger to avoid total insolvency." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving behind his tight silk collar. His hands began to tremble as he reached the second paragraph of the memo. I smiled, offering him a look of absolute icy pity. "The merger collapsed this morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, Aegis Nexus bought out the entire revolving credit line of your server provider, Apex Core. We also acquired the master lease and the hardware infrastructure for the primary server facility your exchange rents." I watched his gaze drop to the very bottom of the page, where a prominent, undeniable signature sat on the authorization line. My signature, Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. "You never earned a spot at the elite table, Julian," I whispered, letting the reality of total ruin wash over him. "You are sitting at my table, and I am liquidating your company by Friday." Julian stared at the heavy cardstock, his eyes tracking the ink as if trying to physically erase the words. The ambient noise of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clinking of ceramic cups, the murmur of morning conversations, all seemed to vanish instantly, replaced only by the sound of his sharp, ragged breathing. He read the second page of the memo, his hands shaking so violently that the paper rustled against the scratched wooden table. It was an internal directive issued straight to the senior managing partners of Apex Core, drafted by my acquisition team. The order was completely non-negotiable. Aegis Nexus, as the new primary stakeholder, was demanding an immediate audit and mandatory shutdown of non-compliant hosting clients. The directive specifically highlighted the immediate termination of specific crypto accounts flagged for suspected money laundering or unauthorized margin trading. "You can't do this," Julian choked out, his voice dropping to a frantic, desperate hiss. He looked around the cafe wildly, checking to see if anyone was watching his public execution, his perfectly packaged elite persona cracking at the seams. "I'm their largest client. I have a flawless compliance record. My volume in the sector is unparalleled. You have absolutely no grounds to flag me for non-compliant operations. This is a bluff. This is an illegal, tortious interference. I will sue Aegis Nexus for every dime you have."
I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands, completely unmoved by the empty threat.
"I wouldn't bring up volume if I were you, Julian. It's a very sensitive topic." I watched the vein in his neck pulse rapidly against his tight collar. "Let's talk about that frozen Cayman Islands account," I continued smoothly, keeping my tone light and conversational. "On October 12th, you logged a 14-hour system outage for a supposed high-frequency algorithmic trade, charging your users a premium fee. It's a shame that on that exact afternoon, you were actually at the Hermes boutique in San Francisco, purchasing a limited edition Birkin bag for Chloe." Julian froze. His mouth went completely dry. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. I didn't stop. On November 3rd, you pulled $2 million from the client asset pool as collateral, claiming it was for cross-exchange arbitrage. Oddly enough, that was the exact weekend you and my dear sister-in-law were staying at a 5-star ski resort in Aspen. Shall I keep going? I have the exact timestamps to match your fraudulent operational logs with Chloe's Instagram posts and your personal credit card receipts. For 2 years, you have been systematically embezzling client funds to feed your wife's shopping addiction and maintain the illusion that you actually belong in my father's tax bracket. Second, you're a fraud, Julian, and you just got caught red-handed. Julian opened his mouth to formulate a lie, but his phone, which had been sitting face up on the table, suddenly let out a sharp email ping. We both looked down at the illuminated screen. The sender was the head of compliance at Apex Core Servers. The subject line read, "Notice of immediate server termination." I nodded toward his phone. "Go ahead, read it." Julian picked up the device with a trembling hand. He swiped open the email, his eyes darting frantically across the screen. I knew exactly what it said, because it was a template my chief operating officer had drafted himself. Effective immediately, Julian's cryptocurrency exchange was being pulled offline. The servers were being seized, he was barred from the facility, and he was informed that a comprehensive audit of his client asset history was being turned over to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He wasn't just losing his servers, he was facing federal felony charges. Julian's phone slipped from his hand, hitting the table with a loud clatter. He gripped the edges of his chair, his breathing turning fast and shallow. A layer of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, glistening under the cafe lights. He yanked violently at his perfect silk tie, as if suddenly suffocating. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the weight of absolute ruin crashed down on him. The alpha male, who had strutted into the cafe, demanding my submission, was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man gasping for air. "You destroyed me," he wheezed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You completely ruined my life."
I picked up my coffee cup and took a calm, unhurried sip.
"I just exposed the rot, Julian. You destroyed yourself. Oh, and before you rush home to update your LinkedIn profile, there's one more piece of corporate business we need to discuss." Julian looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot with terror, looking like a trapped animal. What else could there possibly be?" he gasped, tears of panic brimming in his eyes. I smiled brilliantly. Aegis Nexus doesn't just buy corporate debt. We also hold a significant portfolio of private high-interest loans. In fact, we recently acquired a debt package that included the exact $1.5 million high-risk bridge loan you took out to personally finance your startup's seed phase. As of 10 minutes ago, my company is your primary creditor. According to the acceleration clauses in your specific loan agreement, any cessation of business operations or federal investigation triggers an immediate default. I am calling in the note. I expect full repayment by the end of the month. Julian completely broke down. The infallible, prideful Silicon Valley CEO disintegrated into a pathetic, weeping mess right in the middle of the crowded cafe. "Please, Victoria," he begged, leaning across the table, his voice a frantic, tearful whisper. He reached out to grab my hand, but I pulled it away smoothly, revolted by his touch. "Please, you can't let Chloe find out about this. You know what she's like. If she discovers I don't have a company or money, she'll leave me. She'll file for divorce before the day ends. I'll do whatever you want. Just give me an extension. Don't tell your sister-in-law. I'm begging you."
I looked at the man who, just moments ago, had smugly offered me $5,000 to go rent a truck and move into a slum. I looked at the brother who had proudly threatened to expose my darkest mental health struggles in open court just to win his father's approval. I looked at the person who had happily tossed my clothes and electronics into the mud.
I stood up from the table, sliding my laptop into my leather bag. I looked down at him, my expression completely blank, devoid of any sympathy or mercy. "I promise nothing, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic whimpering. "Enjoy your coffee." I turned and strode out of the cafe, leaving him drowning in his own cold sweat as his entire fake empire burned to the ground. I stepped out of the cafe, and into the crisp, clear morning air of Silicon Valley. Behind me, the chime of the doorbell rang out one last time. The cold air felt refreshing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running away from my family's cruelty. I was actively orchestrating their downfall. The next 3 weeks flew by in a blur of strategic acquisitions and aggressive legal maneuvers. The eviction notice my father had so arrogantly served me had finally progressed to the pre-trial mediation phase. In the state of California, this was a mandatory step before a judge would hear the case. Richard viewed it as a mere formality, an opportunity to flex his expensive legal muscle and force me into submission. He had no idea he was walking straight into his own legal collapse. The mediation was held in a conference room inside the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco's financial district, a space designed as a masterclass in clinical corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a massive mahogany conference table, and stiff leather chairs designed to make a person feel small. I sat on one side of the table, my hands resting casually in my lap. Next to me sat Elijah Vance. Elijah was the top corporate litigator for Aegis Nexus, but he didn't look like a powerhouse attorney. He wore a slightly wrinkled tweed blazer, gold-rimmed glasses, and carried a battered leather briefcase. He looked more like an absent-minded university professor, which was exactly why I hired him. The heavy glass doors swung open, and my father strode into the room. Richard Sterling was dressed in a custom Italian suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his jaw set in his signature, condescending sneer. He didn't even glance in my direction. Right on his heels was Gideon Ross. Gideon was a notorious legal shark, a high-priced attack dog, known for burying opponents in paperwork and breaking them psychologically. He slammed his platinum briefcase onto the table, took his seat, and locked a predatory gaze onto me. "Let's make this quick," Gideon snapped, skipping any form of greeting. "My client is a very busy man. We are here to settle a straightforward, unlawful detainer dispute. You have unlawfully occupied the guest cottage on the Atherton estate, refused a lawful eviction notice, and caused unnecessary emotional distress to the property owner." Elijah adjusted his glasses, looking mildly across the table. "My client is a lawful resident of that estate, Mr. Ross, not an unlawful occupant." Gideon waved his hand dismissively. "Call it whatever makes you comfortable. The reality is that Victoria is an entitled guest who has overstayed her welcome. However, Richard is a forgiving father. He is willing to drop the eviction lawsuit and spare you the public humiliation of a trial." Gideon slid a bound document across the mahogany table. It stopped inches from my hands. "This is a standard settlement agreement," Gideon stated smoothly. "You sign a full waiver relinquishing any and all claims to the Sterling family trust, including the Cartier jewelry collection. In exchange, my client will waive any back rent or legal fees. You take your clothes, you leave California, and you never contact this family again. It's an incredibly generous offer for an unemployed adult." I stared at the document. It was the exact same play Julian had tried to run on me in the cafe, just wrapped in a shinier coat of legalese. And Julian, coincidentally, was nowhere to be found today. He was too busy responding to federal subpoenas. "I'm not signing anything," I said, pushing the document back across the table with a single finger. "And I'm certainly not giving up my mother's jewelry to bail out Richard's collapsing empire." My father finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, hateful slits. "You have always been an obstinate, ungrateful failure, Victoria. I am trying to save you. If you don't sign that document, Gideon will ensure you leave this room with nothing but a mountain of debt." Gideon smiled, a sharp, unpleasant stretching of his lips. He popped open his platinum briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder. He slammed it onto the table with a heavy thud. "If we go to trial," Gideon said, leaning forward aggressively, "we will amend the eviction suit to include severe property damage claims. That folder contains invoices, repair estimates, and photographic evidence detailing exactly $50,000 worth of destruction to the guest cottage. Scratched, denting hardwood floors, ruined vintage wallpaper, broken fixtures." I felt a genuine spike of shock. "You're fabricating damages. Julian and Chloe were the ones who threw my personal belongings out of the window. I never touched those fixtures." Gideon leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. It doesn't matter what actually happened. It matters what I can prove in a courtroom. I have signed affidavits from the estate staff and a highly respected contractor confirming the vandalism. You are an unemployed college dropout with a documented history of mental instability. Who do you think the judge is going to believe? Sign the settlement, Victoria, because if you force my hand, I will press criminal charges for vandalism and destruction of property. You will face real jail time. A dead silence fell over the room. My father leaned back in his chair, looking immensely satisfied. He thought he had backed me into a corner. He thought he had found the perfect lever to crush me.
Next to me, Elijah Vance cleared his throat. It was a soft, polite sound.
Elijah slowly reached into his battered leather briefcase. He didn't pull out a defensive motion. He didn't pull out counter-affidavits. He completely ignored Gideon's fabricated folder of damages. Instead, he pulled out a single thin document and placed it squarely in the center of the table. "Mr. Sterling," Elijah began, his voice mild and non-threatening. "The property damage to the guest cottage is certainly a tragedy. However, we have a much more pressing issue regarding the Atherton estate that requires our attention." Richard frowned, shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. "What are you talking about?" Elijah opened the folder, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, and looked directly at my father. "I am looking at a series of wire transfers and loan originations from the 14th of last month," Elijah said, his tone deceptively conversational. "Can you explain why your signature appears on a $15 million commercial equity loan secured against the Atherton estate?" Gideon scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "My client's financial decisions are entirely irrelevant to these eviction proceedings. You're grasping at straws, Counselor." "Actually," Elijah continued, completely ignoring Gideon, "the loan itself isn't the issue. The issue is the flow of funds. Those $15 million were immediately transferred to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Atherton Holdings LLC. Every ounce of colour drained from Richard's face. His arrogant smirk melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic as he gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning stark white. "May you see, Richard," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the mahogany table. "The Atherton estate is part of an irrevocable family trust. Legally, you cannot borrow against it without the signatures of all living beneficiaries. It required my signature, and I never signed a thing." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like he was suffocating. Gideon turned to his client, his aggressive posture fracturing. "Richard, what are they talking about? I thought you told me this estate was owned free and clear." My father couldn't even look at his own attorney. His eyes were locked onto the document in front of Elijah as if it were a loaded weapon. He had hidden those accounts behind layers of encrypted offshore shell companies and paid a fortune to ensure they were untraceable. He could not comprehend how my quiet, poorly dressed lawyer possessed an exact copy of his Cayman Islands bank records. "That is bank fraud, Richard," I stated, my voice echoing loudly in the silent, glass-walled room. $15 million obtained through forged signatures and hidden in offshore accounts to evade domestic creditors. Aegis Nexus takes a very dim view of fraudulent lending, especially since we just purchased the original mortgage on the Atherton estate. Across the table, Chloe, who had been quietly applying a clear topcoat to her nails and ignoring the legal proceedings, rose. At the words "bank fraud," the small glass bottle slipped from her fingers, toppling onto the polished wood and spilling liquid across the table. She didn't even notice. "A $15 million loan?" Chloe asked, her perfectly pitched voice trembling as her gaze snapped from me to my father. "Richard, what is she talking about? What offshore accounts?" Richard violently jerked in his chair, as if he'd been physically struck. "Shut up, Chloe. Gideon, pack up your briefcase. We're leaving right now. This mediation is over." "I strongly advise against leaving, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said, his tone as pleasant as a schoolteacher's. "Evading a paper trail rarely improves the situation, and I believe Chloe has a vested right to see these documents. After all, she is listed as a primary guarantor on this debt." Chloe let out a sharp, confused laugh. "Guarantor? I'm not a guarantor on anything. I've never taken out a loan in my life. Julian handles all our finances. I reached across the table, took the thin document Elijah produced, and slid it directly down the center of the mahogany wood. It glided smoothly, coming to a stop right in front of my sister-in-law. "Open it, Chloe," I commanded. "Turn to page 4 and look right below Richard's signature. Tell me what you see." Richard lunged forward, stretching his arms across the table to grab the file. "Don't look at that. It's fabricated garbage. They're trying to trick you." But Gideon Ross possessed the instincts of a true legal shark. Before Richard could reach the folder, Gideon slammed his hand down on top of it, pulling the documents toward himself and scanning them with brutal efficiency. The color left the attorney's face as well. He glanced at Richard, then pushed the open folder to Chloe. Chloe stared at the black ink. Her perfectly manicured nail traced a line of blue ink at the bottom of the page. "That's my signature," she whispered, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "But I never signed this. I don't even know what Atherton Holdings LC is." "Think back to the 14th of last month, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "You came to the Atherton estate for Sunday brunch. Richard asked you into his study and handed you a thick stack of papers, telling you they were routine tax authorizations for the family trust. He said it was standard estate maintenance. He turned to the signature page, handed you a pen, and you signed right where he pointed. You didn't read a single paragraph, did you?" Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with mounting dread. "I trusted my father-in-law. Why would I read it?" "Because your father-in-law is a desperate, drowning man," I replied, letting every word sink in. "His corporate credit is completely toxic. No legitimate bank in this country will lend him a single dime. So he needed a clean proxy. Someone with an unblemished financial record, a high credit score, and absolutely blind loyalty. He used you, Chloe. He leveraged your financial standing to secure a $15 million loan, forged your consent as a co-signer, and moved the cash offshore to hide it from his creditors." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, threatening to ruin her designer mascara. "But Julian and I are closing on our new house in Palo Alto next week. We're buying a home. The bank is doing the final credit check tomorrow morning." I leaned back in my leather chair, giving her a smile entirely devoid of warmth. "Julian's company no longer exists, Chloe. His servers were seized this morning for severe compliance violations, and your personal credit score is now anchored to a $15 million defaulted loan under active federal investigation. Your debt-to-income ratio is completely shattered. Your credit is gone. You couldn't get a mortgage for a cardboard box right now, let alone a mansion in Palo Alto. You are financially ruined, and your dear father-in-law is the one who handed you the match." Chloe turned on Richard, her chest heaving as the perfect illusion of her privileged life shattered into millions of sharp pieces. "Richard, tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't use my name." Richard was sweating profusely, gripping the edge of the table as he refused to look at his once prized, elite daughter-in-law. "Sweetheart, you don't understand corporate finance," Richard stammered. "I was protecting family assets. I was going to pay it back before anyone noticed. It was just a temporary bridge loan." Gideon Ross stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He snapped his platinum briefcase shut with an angry click. "You lied to me, Richard," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a freezing temperature. "You sat in my office, looked me in the eye, and swore the title chain on the Atherton estate was completely clean. You swore there were no secondary encumbrances." "Gideon, sit down," Richard roared, his voice cracking with panic. "I pay your retainer to solve my problems, not to lecture me." "You pay me to litigate, not to participate in wire fraud," Gideon shouted, grabbing his coat. "I am bound by professional ethics. I cannot represent a client actively engaged in an ongoing financial crime. I am withdrawing as your counsel immediately. Expect my formal notice of withdrawal by courier this afternoon." Gideon turned and strode out of the glass conference room without looking back, leaving Richard completely exposed. Richard leapt from his chair, his face turning a dangerous shade of deep crimson. He looked like a cornered animal, entirely stripped of his sanity as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "This proves nothing. I will hire a dozen lawyers. I will drag you through the courts until you're too old to walk. We are taking this all the way to trial." He grabbed Chloe's arm, his fingers digging into her silk sleeve. "We're leaving right now." "You're gonna get off me!" Chloe screamed, wrenching her arm away. "You ruined my life. You forged my name. I want to talk to her lawyer. I need to know how to fix my credit." "We are leaving," Richard bellowed, dragging her toward the heavy glass doors. "You don't say another word to these people. You do exactly what I tell you." I watched him drag his sobbing daughter-in-law out of the room, her cries echoing down the marble corridor, long after the doors swung shut. The invincible Sterling family was tearing itself apart from the inside. I looked over at Elijah, who was calmly placing the loan documents back into his battered briefcase. We didn't even need a judge anymore. The trial ahead was going to be an absolute slaughter. The echoes of Richard dragging Chloe out of the mediation room had long since faded, but the war was far from over. He had promised to torment me in court until I was grey, and true to his arrogant nature, he absolutely refused to back down. He managed to scramble and find a new attorney willing to turn a blind eye to his blatant offshore financial irregularities, a sleazy litigator named Marcus Thorne, who specialized in high-conflict family asset disputes. 3 weeks later, we sat inside a solemn wood-paneled courtroom at the San Francisco Federal Courthouse. The air smelled of heavy floor wax and stale tension. Richard took the witness stand after being sworn in. He had dressed carefully for the occasion, trading his flashy custom Italian suits for a subdued conservative navy blazer. He looked the part of a respectable, exhausted patriarch, folding his hands neatly in his lap and offering the judge a tight, sorrowful smile. As Thorne began his direct examination, Richard went straight into an Oscar-level performance. He didn't shout or sneer. Instead, he played the heartbroken father who had exhausted every possible option to save his troubled daughter. "Breaks my heart to sit here today," Richard testified, his voice carrying a calculated tremor. He looked down at his hands and shook his head slowly. "Victoria is 35 years old. I have provided everything for her. I let her live in the guest cottage on the Atherton estate, giving her a roof over her head. I paid for her living expenses, her car, her medical bills. I gave her every advantage a father could offer." Thorne paced in front of the jury box, his tone oozing fake sympathy. "And how did your daughter repay this generosity, Mr. Sterling?" Richard let out a heavy sigh, casting a brief, profoundly sorrowful glance in my direction. "She refused to launch. She refused to seek gainful employment. She locked herself away in that cottage, ordering packages online and living entirely in a fantasy world. She has suffered from severe mental health issues in the past, and I tried to accommodate her. I really did. But my financial resources are not infinite. I tried to reason with her, to ask her to contribute to the household, but she became hostile and delusional. She actually believes she is entitled to live on my property for free forever." I sat next to Elijah, my face a mask of perfect serenity. Richard was weaponizing my past struggles, twisting the low profile I maintained to build my business into evidence of laziness and isolation. He was painting me as a parasite, so his unlawful eviction order would look like an act of responsible, tough love. I had no choice but to initiate eviction proceedings, Richard continued, dabbing at the corner of an eye that wasn't shedding any actual tears. It was the hardest decision of my life, but sometimes a parent must employ tough love to force a child to finally stand on her own 2 feet. I had to push her out of the nest so she could finally learn to fly. The stern-faced older judge gave a sympathetic nod. The narrative was working. Richard was the long-suffering provider, and I was the spoiled, privileged squatter. "To finalize this tragic but necessary legal action," Thorne announced, turning to the judge, "we wish to submit Exhibit A to the court." Thorne walked to the bench, handing a certified document to the clerk, who passed it up to the judge. He then dropped a copy onto our table in front of Elijah. "Mr. Sterling," Thorne said, turning back to my father, "would you please identify this document for the court?" Richard squared his shoulders, a hint of his old arrogance returning to his voice. "That is the master deed for the Atherton estate. It clearly shows that I am the sole, legal owner of the property in fee simple. The house belongs entirely to me, and as the sole owner, I have the absolute legal right to determine who resides there and to evict anyone occupying the property against my wishes." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Thorne said, casting a smug smile in our direction. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge looked over her reading glasses at my lawyer. "Mr. Vance, do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" Elijah Vance stood up slowly. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, buttoned his slightly rumpled tweed jacket, and picked up the copy of the deed Thorne had just provided. He didn't approach the podium with a flashy briefcase. He held only that single sheet of paper. He walked toward the witness stand with a slow, measured stride that suggested he had all the time in the world. Richard braced himself, his jaw tight. He expected Elijah to bring up the offshore accounts. He expected a fight over the forged $15 million loan that had shattered his relationship with Julian and Chloe just weeks prior. Richard had paid his new lawyer a fortune to prepare for blocking any questions about his corporate finances, claiming they were irrelevant to a simple residential eviction. Elijah stopped a few feet from the witness stand. He looked at Richard mildly, his expression entirely unthreatening. "Mr. Sterling," Elijah began, his voice polite and conversational, "you have just testified under oath that this document proves you are the sole and absolute owner of the Atherton estate. Is that correct?" "Yes," Richard replied firmly, his chin lifting proudly. "It's my house. I bought it, I maintained it, and my name is on the deed." Elijah nodded slowly, looking down at the paper in his hand. "It certainly is a very official-looking document. It has the county seal, the proper notarization, and your name is indeed printed right at the top." Richard let out a dry scoff. "I'm glad we're in agreement. Now, perhaps we can conclude this waste of the court's time and proceed with the eviction order." "Not just yet," Elijah murmured. He took a few steps closer, holding up the paper so Richard could see it clearly. "My eyesight isn't what it used to be, Mr. Sterling. Would you do me a favor and read the date stamped in the top right corner of this certified deed? The date of issuance." Richard frowned, annoyed by the trivial request. He leaned forward, squinting at the small black text. "It says October 14th, 2018. Elijah lowered the paper. 2018. You are absolutely certain of that date, Mr. Sterling." Richard let out an irritated sigh, looking at the judge as if seeking relief from this pointless questioning. "Yes, I'm certain. That is when the county issued that specific certified copy for my personal records. The date has absolutely no bearing on my right to own the property." Elijah pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Oh, I don't think so, Mr. Sterling. I think that date is the only thing relevant in this courtroom today." Elijah turned his back on my father and walked slowly back to our table. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, unmarked manila folder. He turned back to face the bench. "Your Honor," Elijah said, his voice suddenly losing its mild, professorial tone. "The defense wishes to submit Exhibit B to the court. This is a fully certified, heavily verified legal title document filed with the county recorder's office exactly 3 days ago." Thorne jumped to his feet, shouting an objection. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. This document was never provided to us during the discovery phase." Elijah didn't back down. "We weren't required to provide it during discovery, Counselor, because this transaction was not legally finalized until 72 hours ago. It became public record only this morning." The judge frowned, waving Thorne back down. "I will allow the submission. What is the nature of this document, Mr. Vance?" Elijah walked to the witness stand and handed the open folder directly to my father. "Mr. Sterling," Elijah said, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "you're holding a deed stamped 2018, but I would like you to read the document I just handed you. Read it aloud to the court, Mr. Sterling. Read the name of the new, legal, sole owner of the Atherton estate." Elijah let the shock of that outdated 2018 deed hang in the heavy courtroom air. He watched calmly as Richard's arrogant, patriarchal mask cracked under the harsh, fluorescent lights. The jury whispered among themselves, their collective gaze shifting from the newly submitted foreclosure documents back to the man sitting in the witness stand. My father had just committed perjury, submitting a voided deed in a desperate attempt to claim ownership over a property he had already lost to his own daughter. But Elijah Vance wasn't finished. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and picked up a fresh stack of manila folders from our table. "Well, let's skip past your deliberate misrepresentation of the title on the Atherton estate, Mr. Sterling," Elijah said, his voice carrying an absolute, unyielding authority. "Let's look at the core of your testimony today. You sat before this judge and this jury and painted a very specific picture. You claim to be a generous, exhausted father. You testified that my client is a delusional guest who drained your vast financial resources, forcing you to employ tough love. Is that an accurate summary of your sworn statements under direct examination? Richard shifted his weight in the heavy oak chair. He tugged at the collar of his conservative navy blazer, beads of sweat suddenly erupting along his hairline. He shot a panicked glance toward his new lawyer, Marcus Thorne, but Thorne was too busy staring in horror at the voided deed to offer an objection. I am a provider, Richard snapped, tilting his chin up in a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. I have provided for my family my entire life. Victoria is an ungrateful child who refuses to understand the value of $1. She locked herself away in my house and contributed nothing to the family. A wealthy provider, Elijah corrected mildly, pacing in front of the jury box. You stated that your resources were being drained by my client. Exactly how vast are those resources, Mr. Sterling? What is your current liquid net worth? Thorne finally snapped out of his shock and leaped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. My client's total net worth has absolutely nothing to do with these eviction proceedings. The plaintiff opened the door to this line of questioning when he weaponized his financial status against my client. Elijah countered smoothly, not even turning his head to look at Thorne. He testified that he was her sole financial lifeline and that her dependency was the catalyst for this lawsuit. I am merely testing the credibility of that specific claim. The judge, an older individual with harsh features and deep-set wrinkles, leaned forward. Objection overruled. The witness will answer the question. Richard puffed out his chest. An attack on his pride was the only thing capable of overriding his legal self-preservation instincts. He gripped the edge of the witness stand and leaned toward the microphone, ready to perform. I am a titan in the California venture capital and commercial real estate sectors, Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. I own tech incubators, office parks, and luxury residential developments in San Francisco, Palo Alto, and San Jose. My portfolio is bulletproof. My personal net worth is conservatively estimated at over $50 million. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard lifted his chin, soaking in the reaction. He was a man who lived and breathed his own myth. He genuinely believed that if he spoke the number loud enough, with enough conviction, it would miraculously remain true. I sat next to Elijah, keeping my expression entirely blank. I knew the truth. I knew what was inside the folders Elijah held. I watched the man who had tormented me for 30 years slowly realize he was trapped in a cage of his own making. $50 million, Elijah repeated, tasting the words as if they were sour. A staggering sum. A true mark of a titan. Let's take a closer look at that bulletproof portfolio, shall we? Elijah slammed the heavy stack of folders down onto the evidence table with a loud bang that made my father visibly flinch in the witness chair. I have right here certified financial records, default notices, and final foreclosure warnings issued within the last 18 months, Elijah said, his mild demeanor vanishing completely, replaced by a razor-sharp legal precision. Let's start with Sterling Plaza in San Jose. According to these certified bank records, you have not made a single mortgage payment on that commercial property in exactly 11 months. Is that correct? Richard's face flushed a deep crimson. The colour travelled up his neck, clashing violently with his white dress collar. The tech retail sector is currently experiencing a temporary localised downturn, he stammered. It's a simple cash flow issue. Standard business operations. And what about the luxury office park in Palo Alto? Elijah pressed, pulling a sheet of paper from the top folder. The one you used as collateral to secure a high-interest commercial loan last year. Records indicate that the primary lender initiated foreclosure proceedings 30 days ago due to non-payment. Is that also standard business operations, Mr. Sterling? I am in the process of restructuring that debt, Richard shouted, his carefully cultivated image of an exhausted patriarch dissolving instantly into pure, aggressive panic. He pointed a trembling finger at Elijah. You are twisting facts to confuse the jury. Venture capital and real estate are games of leverage. You don't understand high-level corporate mechanics. I understand basic arithmetic, Elijah countered, taking a step closer to the witness stand. Let's look at the numbers. You owe $15 million on the San Jose project. You owe $8 million on the Palo Alto development. You have $5 million in unsecured high-interest commercial loans. You have a string of unpaid vendor invoices across 3 states and massive tax liens pending against your holding companies. Elijah paused, letting the devastating, undeniable list of failures echo in the quiet courtroom. You don't have a net worth of $50 million, Mr. Sterling, Elijah stated, his voice carrying an absolute finality. According to these certified banking notices, your liabilities far exceed your assets. You are not a wealthy provider. You are $20 million in the red. You are financially bankrupt. Absolute chaos erupted in the courtroom. The grand illusion of Richard Sterling, the invincible Silicon Valley tycoon, had been publicly slaughtered. He wasn't a long-suffering father practicing tough love. He was a desperate, drowning fraud who had tried to throw his daughter onto the street just to maintain a pathetic facade. Richard was drenched in sweat. Large beads rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes. He looked frantically at Thorne, but his sleazy attorney was staring at the defense table in pure horror, completely unable to stop the bleeding. Richard let out a harsh, arrogant chuckle, desperately trying to reclaim even a shred of superiority. "This is absurd," Richard sneered, looking directly at the judge. "This lawyer is trying to blind you with out-of-context documents. Yes, the market is challenging. Yes, there is debt on the ledgers, but I have personal relationships with my lenders. I am a man of standing in this city." He turned his venomous gaze back onto Elijah. "You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, Mr. Vance? You're out of your depth. I sat down with the regional director of National Trust just last week. We had an expensive steak dinner, shook hands, and they extended the grace period on all my commercial mortgages for another 6 months. The bank and I have an understanding. They know I'm good for the money. I am completely safe." Elijah Vance stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, letting Richard's arrogant, delusional proclamation hang heavily in the air. He ensured that the jury, the gallery, and the judge absorbed the sheer hubris of the statement. Then Elijah adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and looked at my father with a gaze cold enough to freeze blood. "Which bank, Mr. Sterling?" Elijah asked, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Because National Trust sold your entire commercial debt portfolio yesterday morning." The heavy strike of the judge's gavel cut through the stunned silence. Richard slumped back into the witness chair, as if the bones in his legs had suddenly melted. His mouth hung slightly open, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He had nothing left to say. The grand illusion was dead. "Your Honor," Swan stammered, shuffling frantically through the papers on his table. "The plaintiff requests a brief recess to review these documents." "Denied," the judge announced coldly, her stern gaze locked onto my father. "The court will not pause for you to reconcile your client's bank records. Do you have any redirect for this witness, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving behind his tight collar. "No, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Chloe Sterling to the stand." Richard stepped down from the witness box, his movements stiff and mechanical. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the jury. He kept his eyes locked onto the polished mahogany doors at the back of the room. Chloe stood up from the front row of the gallery. Typically, my sister-in-law treated any public appearance like a runway show. Today, she looked completely diminished. She wore a pale pink cashmere dress that seemed to swallow her petite frame. Her hands were visibly shaking as she walked past the defense table. She took the oath, her voice barely a whisper, and sat down in the wooden chair. She kept glancing toward the gallery. I followed her gaze to Julian, who was sitting in the second row. He was dressed in a sharp grey suit, trying desperately to maintain the appearance of a successful tech CEO. But his knee was bouncing rapidly against the wooden bench in front of him, looking like a man waiting for the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Thorne approached the witness stand, eager to shift the jury's attention away from Richard's disastrous financial ruin. "Mrs. Sterling," Thorne began, adopting a soft, sympathetic tone. "We are here today to address the eviction of your sister-in-law, Victoria. Can you describe her behaviour during her time residing at the Atherton estate?" Chloe gripped the edges of the wooden box. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room before settling on Thorne. "She was a menace," Chloe recited, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "She was constantly yelling at the estate staff. She broke antique vases in the hallway. She intentionally scratched the hardwood floors in the guest cottage just to spite my father-in-law. We were all terrified of her. She's completely unstable." Thorne nodded solemnly, turning toward the jury to ensure they took in the rehearsed lines. "And did she contribute financially to the household?" "Never," Chloe said, a hint of her old arrogance returning to her voice. "She just locked herself away in her room and expected my father-in-law to pay for everything. She was a parasite. For the safety and sanity of the family, he had no choice but to evict her." "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling," Thorne said, walking back to his seat with a triumphant nod. "No further questions." Elijah Vance stood up. He didn't carry any folders this time. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom, hands slipped casually into the pockets of his tweed trousers. "Mrs. Sterling," Elijah said mildly, "you have painted my client as a financial burden. Tell me, do you consider yourself financially independent?" Chloe lifted her chin, her perfectly styled hair catching the courtroom lights. "Absolutely. I have my own household. I am married to a very successful tech CEO. We don't rely on my father-in-law for anything." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "A successful CEO. That would be Julian, correct? I understand your lifestyle is quite comfortable. You currently lease 2 vehicles, a Mercedes G-Wagon in your name, and a Porsche Taycan in your husband's name. Is that accurate?" Thorne stood up. "Objection. Relevance. The witness's personal vehicles have absolutely nothing to do with this eviction case. It goes to credibility, Your Honor," Elijah responded without turning around. "The witness is claiming my client is a financial parasite while holding herself up as a paragon of independence. I'm merely establishing the baseline of that independence." "Objection overruled," the judge said. "You may answer the question, Mrs. Sterling." "Yes, we drive nice cars," Chloe snapped, glaring at Elijah. "We work hard. We earn them." "Your tastes are quite expensive," Elijah continued smoothly. "According to public social media posts, you recently returned from a 10-day ski trip to Aspen. You regularly purchase designer handbags, specifically from Hermes and Chanel. And I understand you are currently under contract to purchase a $10 million property in Palo Alto." Chloe smiled, a smug, self-satisfied look returning to her face. "My husband provides a very good life for me. He is the founder and CEO of a rising cryptocurrency exchange. We close on the Palo Alto home next week." Elijah took his hands out of his pockets. He walked back to our table, picked up a manila folder, and approached the witness stand. He handed the open folder to Chloe. "Mrs. Sterling, I'd like you to look at these documents. These are subpoenaed financial records for your personal and joint bank accounts. Would you mind reading aloud the current balance on your Platinum American Express card?" Chloe looked down at the paper. Her smug smile vanished instantly. She blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the document as if the numbers would miraculously rearrange themselves. "This can't be right," Chloe whispered. "Please read the number for the court, Mrs. Sterling," Elijah instructed firmly. "It says the balance is $185,000. Chloe choked out, the color draining from her face. "But that's impossible. Julian pays that card off in full every month." "Evidently he missed a payment," Elijah pointed out dryly. "Or perhaps several. Now turn to page 2. That is the ledger for your joint checking account. Can you point to the last payroll deposit from his cryptocurrency firm?" Chloe scanned the page frantically, her perfectly manicured nail sliding down the column of numbers. "There's nothing here," she said, her voice rising with panic. "There hasn't been a deposit in 2 weeks. Where is his salary? Where is the money?" Elijah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a quiet, devastating tone. "Your husband hasn't deposited a salary, Mrs. Sterling, because he no longer has a company. His firm was entirely liquidated this morning by Aegis Nexus for fraudulent trading and misappropriation of client funds. His exchange has been seized, and he is currently facing subpoenas from the SEC. Shocked whispers erupted in the courtroom. Chloe dropped the folder, the papers scattering across the floor of the witness box. She gripped the microphone, her breathing turning fast, heavy, and audible. "That's a lie!" Chloe screamed, looking around wildly. "Julian goes to work every day. He leaves the house at 7 a.m. in a suit. He told me the mortgage for the Palo Alto house was fully approved yesterday." "Your Palo Alto mortgage was denied 3 days ago," Elijah stated loudly, cutting through her mounting hysteria. "It was denied because your husband has no income, and because your personal credit score was entirely destroyed when Richard forged your signature to secure that $15 million offshore loan. You are completely broke, Mrs. Stalling. Your cards are maxed out, your vehicles are currently scheduled for repossession, and your husband has been lying to your face every single morning." Chloe froze. The bubble of privilege she had enjoyed was entirely punctured, the reality of absolute ruin finally penetrating her facade. She slowly turned her head, her eyes wide with terror as she searched the gallery. She found Julian. He had stood up and was moving slowly along the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. He was drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with the panic and guilt of a man who had just been caught in the ultimate lie. "Julian!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with pure agony. Julian didn't answer. He pushed through the wooden doors and sprinted into the corridor, leaving his wife sobbing uncontrollably on the witness stand as her entire world turned to ash in front of the judge and jury. "Order!" the judge roared, slamming her gavel down hard as the gallery erupted into a frenzy of whispers. "Recess for 15 minutes. The court will reconvene in 20. Chloe practically fell out of the witness box. She tripped over the hem of her cashmere dress, completely ignoring the judge, her lawyer, and my father, as she ran down the center aisle of the courtroom and pushed through the swinging wooden doors, desperate to catch her fleeing husband. I stood up slowly, smoothing down the front of my blazer. Elijah Vance calmly organized his manila folders, tucking them back into his battered leather briefcase. He gave me a brief, knowing nod. Together, we walked out of the courtroom and stepped into the wide marble corridor of the courthouse. It didn't take long to find them. Julian had been cornered near the elevator bank. His finger was pressing the down button repeatedly, desperate to escape the building before his wife reached him. He was too late. Chloe grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. Her face was a mask of tear-streaked mascara, her perfect blowout completely ruined as her eyes stretched wide with a manic, terrifying clarity. "Tell me that was a lie," Chloe screamed, her voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceiling. "Tell me that pathetic lawyer was lying. Where is your salary, Julian? What happened to our house in Palo Alto?" Julian looked around the corridor. Court clerks, paralegals, and opposing lawyers had stopped to watch the spectacle. He reached out, trying to grab her hands to quiet her down. "Chloe, please. Not here. Lower your voice. Let's go home." "You don't have a home," she shrieked, slapping his hands away as if he had burned her. "Is it true? Did they seize your company?" Julian's shoulders slumped. The last remaining remnants of his arrogant Silicon Valley CEO armor dissolved, leaving a terrified, broken man. He couldn't meet her gaze. He stared down at the marble floor, his voice cracking. "Yes. My company is gone. The SEC is auditing all my transaction logs." Chloe gasped, taking a physical step back from him. Her hand flew to her mouth. "You lied to me. You put on a suit every day and told me you were going to the office. I ordered hundreds of thousands of dollars in custom furniture for the Palo Alto estate yesterday. I charged $50,000 to my black card because you told me the balance was clear." "How could the balance be clear?" Julian snapped, his panic finally mutating into a defensive anger. "I haven't had a salary in weeks. You spend money faster than I could misappropriate it, Chloe. You buy Hermes bags and take trips to Aspen, while I'm drowning in debt trying to maintain the sterling standard of living. The Palo Alto house is gone. The deposit is gone. We have absolutely nothing left." Chloe let out a guttural sob, burying her face in her hands. The Silicon Valley princess, the woman who had spent her life looking down at me from a pedestal built on inherited wealth and fabricated perfection, was publicly unraveling. Before Julian could even attempt to comfort her, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom flew open. Richard Sterling stormed into the corridor, His face twisted into a mask of pure rage. Marcus Thorne trotted nervously behind him, looking like a defeated dog. Richard walked straight up to Julian. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't comfort his weeping daughter-in-law. He immediately looked for a scapegoat to reclaim his own sense of power. "You pathetic, useless disappointment," Richard hissed, getting directly into Julian's face. "You brought this humiliation into a public courthouse. You let your wife get humiliated on the witness stand. I approved of this marriage because you promised me you could provide for her and that your company would bring value to this family. You are a complete failure." Julian flinched, stepping back until his spine hit the elevator doors. Richard pressed forward, raising his voice to draw even more onlookers from the corridor. "You ruined my daughter-in-law's life," Richard spat, jabbed a thick finger into Julian's chest. "You are a fraud, a cheap, incompetent fraud. I will ensure you never find work in this state again. I will bury you so deep you'll never see the light of day. You are absolutely nothing to this family anymore." For a second, Julian looked like he was about to cry. He looked exactly like the terrified coward who had begged me in the cafe not to expose him. But something shifted in his eyes. He looked at his sobbing wife, and then he looked back at his arrogant, sneering father.
The sheer hypocrisy of Richard Sterling finally pushed Julian over the edge.
"I ruined her life," Julian roared, pushing Richard's hand away with a sudden burst of strength. "Who are you to judge me? You are financially bankrupt. You have defaulted on every single property you own." Richard's face turned purple. "Lower your voice, you ungrateful boy." "No, I am absolutely not lowering my voice," Julian bellowed, taking a step forward and forcing Richard to actually take a step back. "You call me a fraud. You use your own family as human shields. You were so desperate for cash that you forged Chloe's signature to secure a $15 million offshore loan. You ruined her credit. You guaranteed she will never get a mortgage again. I lost my company, Richard, but you actively committed federal wire fraud. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood to save your sinking empire. You are the true parasite here." Cunt. A dead silence fell over the corridor. The allegations hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The court clerks were staring openly. A competing attorney from another firm had pulled out his phone, likely texting everyone he knew about the absolute collapse of the great Richard Sterling. Chloe lifted her face from her hands, her mascara-stained eyes darting between her husband and her father-in-law. The realization hit her. The two men she had trusted implicitly, the two men who had funded her lavish reality, had completely betrayed her. She let out a small, broken whimper and slid down the marble wall, collapsing onto the floor and pulling her knees into her chest. Richard looked around the corridor, realizing the gravity of the public spectacle. His chest heaved as he struggled to maintain his composure. He smoothed down the lapels of his navy suit, his eyes darting wildly as he searched for a way to regain control. He turned his venomous gaze toward me. I stood a few yards away, arms crossed, watching his empire burn. He opened his mouth to hurl another threat, but the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom opened once more. The bailiff stepped into the corridor, his face completely expressionless. "Court is back in session," the bailiff announced loudly. "All parties must return to the courtroom immediately." Richard let out a sharp breath. He looked down at Chloe, crying on the floor, and then at Julian, stewing by the elevators. He abandoned them both. Turning his back on his broken family, he strode toward the courtroom doors. Get inside, Thorne," Richard snapped over his shoulder to his lawyer. "This isn't over. I still own the Atherton estate. I'm still evicting that ungrateful squatter, and I'm going to ensure she pays for every single second of this embarrassment." He pushed past the bailiff, his chin held high as he strode back into the courtroom, entirely convinced he could still win the war. He had no idea that Elijah Vance had saved the absolute most devastating piece of evidence for last. The heavy oak doors slammed shut as Richard strode back toward the plaintiff's table, cutting off the messy echoes of Chloe's crying in the marble corridor. Richard walked down the centre aisle with the rigid, aggressive posture of a victorious general, ignoring the frantic whispers from the gallery and the empty chair next to him that belonged to his son. Richard smoothed the lapels of his custom navy blazer, adjusted his cuffs, and lowered his massive frame into the leather seat. His legal counsel, Thorne, looked far less confident. The seasoned lawyer wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, his eyes darting nervously toward our defense table. Thorne could feel that the tectonic plates of this trial had shifted dramatically, but Richard was completely blinded by his own towering ego. In my father's mind, he was still the untouchable titan of local real estate and venture capital. He believed that if he spoke loud enough and dominated the room with enough aggression, reality would bend to his will. I sat perfectly still next to Elijah Vance. I didn't fidget. I didn't look away. I kept my hands folded neatly on the polished wood of the defense table, watching the man who had tormented me my entire life prepare to dig his own grave. Judge Rosalind took her seat on the elevated bench, her sharp, angular features set in a grim line of judicial exhaustion. She had just witnessed a spectacular, humiliating internal family explosion spill into her courthouse corridors, and her patience was entirely spent. She picked up her gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that instantly silenced the whispering gallery. "Court is back in session," Judge Rosalind announced, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "We are here to conclude the plaintiff's application for an emergency residential eviction. Mr. Sterling, before I issue my ruling on this matter, does your counsel have any final legal arguments to present?" Thorne opened his mouth, reaching for his legal pad, but Richard brutally waved him down. My father pushed his chair back with a loud, grating scrape against the floor, standing up to his full, imposing height. He didn't need his lawyer to speak for him. Richard needed to perform. He needed to re-establish his patriarchal dominance and humiliate me, one last time, in public. "Your Honour, I don't need my lawyer to explain the basic tenets of property law," Richard boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger straight at me. "I am the victim in this courtroom. You have seen the kind of circus my ungrateful family has turned into today. I am surrounded by bloodsuckers and failures, but the girl sitting right there is the worst of them all." I didn't even blink. I met his furious gaze with a cold, hollow stare. "I gave her everything," Richard declared, puffing out his chest, completely immersed in his fabricated, righteous indignation. "I sheltered her. I fed her. I gave her a roof over her head on my own private estate, while she contributed absolutely nothing to society. She's a drain on my resources and a clear threat to my family. I own the Atherton estate. It is my property. I built my empire with my own two hands, and I will absolutely not allow a lazy, incompetent squatter to occupy my home." Richard took a deep breath, his face flushed with the heat of his own aggression, delivering his final arrogant plea to the judge. "Without me, she'd be living on the streets right now. I am merely asking to evict her to teach her a lesson. She needs to understand the harsh realities of the real world. I demand that this court uphold my lawful property rights and order the marshals to remove her from my estate immediately." Richard sat back down, heavily. He cast a vicious, triumphant smirk in my direction, entirely convinced that his passionate and powerful speech had secured his victory. He believed he had successfully painted himself as a benevolent, long-suffering father administering a necessary dose of tough love. Judge Rosalind did not look impressed. She didn't offer a sympathetic nod. Instead, she turned her sharp gaze toward our table. "Mr. Vance, do you have any response to the plaintiff's final statement?" Elijah Vance stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse or engage in emotional grandstanding. He simply picked up a single manila folder from his briefcase and held it out. "Your Honor," Elijah said, his tone mild and conversational, standing in stark contrast to Richard's bombastic address. "The defense does not need to offer a verbal response. We respectfully ask the court to review the final document we submitted into evidence just prior to the recess. It is sitting on your bench, marked as Defense Exhibit B. I believe this document will provide an educational experience regarding property rights for everyone in this room." Judge Rosalind frowned slightly. She reached out and picked up the thick, notarized stack of papers Elijah indicated, adjusting her reading glasses to scan the first page. The silence in the courtroom became heavy and suffocating as everyone watched the judge's face. Thorne leaned forward, his brow furrowed with deep anxiety and confusion. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set stubbornly.
As Judge Rosalind read through the dense legal text, her stern, detached features began to shift entirely. Her eyebrows arched toward her hairline. She turned to the second page, her eyes darting across corporate filings, acquisition deeds, and certified financial seals. She read the approval stamp from the county clerk and looked at the final signatures.
Slowly, Judge Rosalind lowered the document. She took off her reading glasses, letting them drop onto the bench. She looked at Richard, who was sitting proudly at his table. Then she looked at Thorne, who was already sweating visibly. Finally, she turned her gaze directly to me. The judge's expression was a mix of profound shock and a deep, unspoken respect. She shook her head in disbelief, then turned her focus back to the plaintiff's table. "So they genuinely have no idea," Judge Rosalind said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. Thorne frowned, his professional composure fracturing as a primal panic flooded his system. He stood up, hands gripping the edge of his table. "Have no idea about what, Your Honour?" Judge Rosalind didn't look at the attorney. She stared directly at Richard Sterling, her eyes carrying an absolute devastating pity. "The fact that she is the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Nexus," Judge Rosalind stated clearly, her words landing like a fatal blow to the Sterling Empire. "She owns the firm that currently holds all your mortgages." Richard Sterling's jaw dropped. The absolute certainty that had sustained his existence shattered in an instant. He stared at Elijah Vance as if the lawyer had just spoken a foreign language. Elijah didn't give my father even a second to recover. He reached back into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a second manila folder, this one featuring a prominent red label. He stepped forward and delivered it to the bench. "Your Honour," Elijah said, his voice carrying an absolute authority. "While we have established that the Atherton estate is now the lawful property of Aegis Nexus, the forensic financial audits my client conducted during the corporate acquisition process revealed a severe irregularity. It is an irregularity that requires the court's immediate attention. Inside that red folder is a $15 million commercial equity loan agreement, ostensibly taken out by Mr. Sterling's primary holding company exactly 6 months ago. Judge Rosalind opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the top document, her stern frown deepening into a mask of pure judicial fury as she read each line. She looked down at Richard, completely stripping away any remaining respect the court might have held for him. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly low register. "This loan lists the Atherton estate as secondary collateral. However, the primary guarantor listed on this document is Chloe Sterling. The signature at the bottom of this financial guarantee belongs to your daughter-in-law." Richard's face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. He gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table, his knuckles turning white as he fought desperately to maintain his collapsing facade. "That is an internal family financial matter," Richard stammered, his booming voice reduced to a defensive growl. "My daughter-in-law acts as a silent partner in several of my corporate LLCs. I handle all the complex paperwork on her behalf to protect her interests. This is standard operating procedure for wealthy family trusts." Elijah turned sharply to face the gallery. I saw Chloe sitting in the second row. After watching her husband publicly admit to losing everything, she looked entirely deflated, her posture slumped. But at the explicit mention of her name and the $15 million loan, her head snapped up. "Is it standard procedure," Elijah asked, looking directly at my sister-in-law, "to leverage your daughter-in-law's personal credit to secure a high-risk offshore commercial loan without her knowledge?" Judge Rosalind slammed her gavel once, silencing the sudden eruption of whispers from the gallery. She turned her intense, scrutinizing gaze directly onto Chloe. "Mrs. Sterling, please stand up." Chloe slowly stood up from the wooden bench, her hands shaking violently. She looked over at my father, who was glaring at her with a desperate, threatening expression, silently commanding her to play along and protect the family image. But Chloe had already watched her husband admit to losing everything. The grand illusion of the Sterling Empire was dead. "Mrs. Sterling?" Judge Rosalind asked, her voice clear to ensure the court reporter captured every single word. 6 months ago, did you formally authorize your father-in-law to secure a $15 million lien using your name and personal credit. Chloe looked at the stamped documents in the judge's hands. She looked at Richard, who was practically trembling with rage at the plaintiff's table. Then, the terrifying reality of her ruined financial future finally hit her. She had massive credit card debt, a husband under federal investigation, and a father-in-law who had secretly traded her future to save his own skin. No! Chloe screamed, her voice echoing wildly through the open courtroom. No! I never signed that document. I didn't even know what an LLC was. He told me it was a routine credit line increase, so I could buy custom furniture for our new house. He lied to me. He forged my signature. Judge Rosalind's face turned to stone. She looked down at Richard, who was now visibly shrinking into his chair, utterly trapped by his own hubris. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. This court is no longer dealing with a simple residential eviction or a standard property foreclosure. Forging signatures to secure tens of millions of dollars in commercial loans across state lines is wire fraud. That is a serious federal felony. Richard tried to speak, but no sound came out. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish suffocating on a dry dock. Judge Rosalind turned sharply to the court stenographer. Madam Clerk, I want the entirety of today's transcript, along with defense exhibits B and F, immediately sealed and referred to the district attorney's office for a federal review. Richard let out a choked, rattling gasp. The man who had confidently swaggered into this courtroom, expecting to throw me onto the street, was now staring down the barrel of a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. This application for eviction is dismissed with prejudice, Judge Rosalind announced, lifting her gavel high. Mr. Sterling, I strongly advise you to retain a criminal defense attorney before the sun sets. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck the block with a final echoing crack. Absolute chaos erupted in the gallery. Reporters scrambled toward the heavy double doors, racing to break the news of Richard Sterling's complete and utter collapse. I stood up slowly from the defense table, calmly smoothing down the front of my tailored blazer. Elijah packed the files into his briefcase and gave me a tight, satisfied nod. I left the defense table, pushed through the swinging wooden doors, and stepped out into the wide marble corridor of the courthouse. The air was thick with frantic, chaotic energy, but the moment I appeared, the crowd instinctively parted to give me a clear path. The power dynamic had completely reversed. I was no longer the pathetic exiled daughter they could mock. I was the chief executive officer of Aegis Nexus. I owned the very ground they were standing on. Before I could reach the elevator bank, a figure lunged out from behind a marble pillar. It was Julian. He hadn't fled the building after his public humiliation. He had been waiting in the shadows for me. His designer suit was rumpled, his silk tie loosened, and his arrogant corporate armor had completely dissolved into a pathetic, shivering mess of desperation. "Victoria, wait," Julian gasped, practically throwing his body into my path to block the exit. "Please, just give me 2 minutes. You have to hear me out." I stopped, looking at my disgraced younger brother with the cold, detached gaze of a stranger. Elijah stepped forward, ready to physically intervene, but I raised a hand to hold him back. "You have exactly 1 minute, Julian," I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion. Julian swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the crowded corridor. He was drenched in sweat. Oh, look, I know I was incredibly harsh before. I was under massive pressure. But you're the CEO of Aegis Nexus. You own the debt. You have the absolute power to fix this. The SEC is only auditing me because of Dad's toxic accounts. If you just make one phone call, vouch for my character, or move Aegis's legal business to my exchange accounts, they'll reinstate me today. You know I'm a brilliant CEO. I can work for your firm. I'll do whatever you want." I stared at him, letting the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words hang heavily in the air. "You want me to hire a man who spent the last 3 years calling me a parasite to my face?"
Julian wiped the sweat from his forehead frantically. He stepped closer, dropping his voice to a desperate, whining pitch, completely willing to throw his family under the bus to save his own skin.
"It wasn't my fault, Victoria," Julian pleaded, shaking his head rapidly. "It was Chloe. She forced my hand. She demanded the massive estate in Palo Alto. She demanded the Chanel bags and the luxury sports cars. She spent money at a rate no human being could legally sustain. She's a financial black hole. She's the one who forced me to cut corners and hide Dad's fraudulent operations, just to maintain her insane, impossible standard of living. I was a victim of her greed. I had to do it to survive. Julian was so focused on begging for his professional life that he didn't even notice the heavy wooden doors pushing open behind him. He didn't see Chloe step out into the corridor. Her face was pale, her makeup entirely ruined, and her eyes burned with a fresh, violent fury. She had heard every single word her husband just said. Chloe marched across the marble floor. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She walked straight up behind Julian, grabbed the shoulder of his expensive suit, and spun him around. Before Julian could even register her presence, Chloe swung her arm back and slapped him across the face with everything she had. The sharp crack of the slap split the air like a whip, echoing violently down the vaulted marble corridor. Julian staggered backward with a pained shout, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek in shock. Onlookers gasped, their phones instantly flying into the air to record the public, hostile dissolution of the Sterling marriage. "You cowardly, pathetic little worm," Chloe hissed, her voice shaking with absolute unfiltered disgust. "You blame your crimes on me. You lied to me for months. You let your father destroy my credit and steal my future, and now you're begging your sister for a job while throwing me under the bus in a public courthouse? We are completely done, Julian. I'm filing for divorce today." Julian stood frozen, caught between the furious wife who had just turned on him and the powerful sister he had mistreated for years. He looked back at me, his eyes wide and pleading, desperately hoping for a final lifeline. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I watched the chaotic, miserable spectacle of this family destroying each other in the corridor. They were completely consumed by the toxic greed they had spent their entire lives worshipping, and they were finally paying the price. I stepped around Julian, completely ignoring his outstretched, trembling hand. I walked past Chloe, who was glaring at her husband with undisguised hatred. I strode to the elevator bank and pulled my phone from my blazer pocket, dialing the direct line to my head of private security. The call connected instantly. "Send the tactical team to the Atherton estate," I ordered, my voice cutting clearly over the frantic noise of the corridor. "Lock down the entire perimeter and change every single lock on the property. We execute the full repossession tomorrow morning at exactly 8 a.m. If anyone with the last name Sterling is still inside that house when you arrive, you have my full authorization to remove them by force." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, stepped into the waiting elevator, and watched the metal doors slide shut, closing the door on my former family for good. Exactly 24 hours later, my driver turned the wheel of the sleek black SUV, pulling into the winding mile-long driveway of the Atherton estate. 2 local sheriff's cruisers rode ahead of us, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the crisp morning air. Behind my vehicle, a fleet of heavy commercial moving trucks, bearing the sharp, obsidian logo of Aegis Nexus, followed in a synchronized line. The towering iron gates, which had once been locked to keep me out in the freezing rain, were held wide open by the deputies. The heavy crunch of tires rolling over the imported gravel sounded like a steady drumbeat, signaling the final devastating conclusion of the Sterling Empire. I stepped out of the SUV, buttoning my tailored coat. The scene unfolding across the pristine, manicured lawns was a masterpiece of absolute humiliating panic. The grand mahogany front doors of the mansion were flung wide open. Inside the vaulted marble foyer, the illusion of untouchable wealth had completely dissolved into frantic desperation. Richard and Chloe were running back and forth through the entryway like trapped animals. They weren't carefully packing their belongings into luxury leather trunks. They were frantically stuffing armfuls of designer dresses, loose jewelry, and whatever silverware they could grab from the dining room into cheap black plastic garbage bags. I stood by the hood of my vehicle, watching Chloe drag a bulging, ripping trash bag full of custom shoes down the front steps. Her hair was a matted mess. Dressed in sweatpants and a stained designer hoodie, she was unrecognizable from the glossy, arrogant Silicon Valley wife who had sneered at me in court just yesterday. She was weeping hysterically, stumbling over the heavy plastic bag, as she tried to drag it toward the estate's boundary line. Before Chloe could even make it to the end of the driveway, a low, guttural roar of a diesel engine echoed across the estate. A heavy-duty commercial flatbed tow truck backed aggressively into the driveway, bypassing the sheriff's cruisers and heading straight for the massive 4-car garage. Chloe dropped her trash bag. Her eyes widened in pure horror as 2 men in high-visibility vests hopped out of the truck and immediately began hooking heavy steel chains around the front axle of her brand-new custom white Mercedes.
Stop it, Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking as she sprinted across the gravel. Get your hands off my car. You can't tow my car. Do you know who I am?
The lead repossession agent didn't even blink. He casually pulled a clipboard from his jacket, holding it up to block her waving hands. I don't care who you are, lady, the agent said, his voice dripping with blue-collar indifference. What I care about is that the primary lessee, Julian Sterling, stopped making payments on this vehicle 4 months ago. The bank called in the note this morning. This car belongs to the dealership now. Stand back, or I'll have the deputy arrest you for interfering with a lawful asset repossession. Chloe froze. The reality of her husband's absolute financial betrayal washed over her. Julian hadn't just hidden his father's toxic liabilities. He had entirely drained their personal accounts to cover his own tracks, leaving her with absolutely nothing. She collapsed right there on the gravel, pulling her knees to her chest as she sobbed uncontrollably, watching her ultimate status symbol get hoisted into the air and towed away. While Chloe wept on the gravel, the lead sheriff Jaitar strode up the grand stone steps of the mansion. He pulled a heavy-duty staple gun from his belt and physically slammed a bright yellow notice of eviction directly onto the center of the custom mahogany front door. Mr. Sterling, the deputy announced, his voice booming across the estate. This property is now under the legal possession of Aegis Nexus. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises with whatever belongings you can physically carry. After 10 minutes, my deputies will escort you off this land by force, and if you return, you will be arrested for criminal trespass. Richard stood frozen in the center of the marble foyer. A black trash bag, stuffed with silk suits, slipped from his thick fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He looked at the bright yellow paper stapled to his front door. He looked at his daughter-in-law crying on the driveway. Then he looked at the fleet of moving trucks idling on his lawn, prepared to erase every trace of his existence. The reality of his situation finally broke him. The federal fraud charges were looming. His corporate accounts were frozen tight by the government. His creditors had seized every remaining asset he possessed. He had no cash, no leverage, and no friends left to call. Richard stumbled forward. He walked out of the massive entryway and slowly descended the stone steps. His breathing was shallow and rapid. The commanding posture of the fierce real estate and venture titan was entirely gone, replaced by the hunched, trembling frame of a broken man. He walked across the gravel driveway, heading straight toward where I stood, leaning against my SUV. My security detail immediately stepped forward to intercept him, but I raised a single finger, silently ordering them to stand down. Richard stopped 3 feet in front of me. He looked down at my polished leather shoes, then up at my face. He no longer saw the scared young girl standing in the rain. He saw the architect of his absolute destruction. His legs gave out. Richard Sterling collapsed onto the sharp gravel, falling heavily to his knees right in front of me. "Victoria!" Richard gasped, his voice a pathetic, watery whisper. "Please, I'm begging you. The federal agents cleared out my accounts. My credit cards are all declined. I don't even have the cash to rent a motel room for the night. I have nowhere to go. I'm your father. You can't just leave me on the street. Please, Victoria, just give me one of the guest rooms. Let me stay in the pool house. I'll do whatever you want." I looked down at the man who had once commanded me to beg. I watched the gravel dig into his knees. I let the silence stretch out, a long, agonizing moment to ensure he felt the full, crushing weight of his absolute surrender. The cold wind swept across the manicured lawns of the Atherton estate, rattling the bare branches of the ancient oak trees and carrying the sharp scent of an early frost. The flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruisers cast rhythmic, jarring shadows across Richard Sterling's face. His custom suit trousers were ruined, grinding into the damp dirt and sharp stones of the driveway. The hands that had spent decades pointing fingers and slamming boardroom tables now hung limply at his sides. I looked down at him, and I felt absolutely nothing. No surge of triumph, no rush of adrenaline, and certainly no mercy. Just the cold satisfaction of watching a long overdue equation finally balance itself out. "Victoria, please," Richard whimpered, his voice cracking violently. It was a pathetic sound, entirely stripped of the booming patriarchal authority he had wielded like a club for my entire life. "You are my daughter. I am your father. You have to listen to me. We are blood." He tried to reach out, his trembling fingers brushing against the hem of my cashmere coat. I took a definitive step back. The crunch of my heel against the gravel sounded as loud as a gunshot. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Do not touch me," I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that forced him to strain to hear it. "You lost the right to call yourself my father 10 years ago." Richard shook his head frantically, his jowls trembling. "You don't mean that. You're angry, and you have every right to be, but this is too far. You've made your point. You won. You beat me. But you can't do this to your own flesh and blood. You can't put me on the street. It's inhumane. We are family, Victoria. Family protects family."
Family, I repeated, tasting the word on my tongue as if it were a foreign concept. I looked around slowly at the chaotic scene. I looked at Chloe, who was still weeping hysterically on the lawn where her repossessed Mercedes used to sit. I looked at the moving trucks idling heavily in the driveway, their exhaust mixing with the cold air.
Then I looked back down at the broken man kneeling at my feet. "Where was your profound loyalty to family, Richard, when you threw me out into a torrential downpour?" I asked, my tone conversational but razor-sharp. "Where was your lecture about flesh and blood when I was 25 years old, shivering in soaked clothes, begging you to let me back inside because I had nowhere else to go? You stood right behind that marble colonnade, watching me cry. You locked the heavy oak doors, went back to your dinner, and left me to sleep on a bus bench." Richard closed his eyes tightly. Tears of pure selfish terror finally spilled over his lashes, carving lines through the dust on his flushed cheeks. "I was making you strong," he choked out, desperately trying to grasp at the ghost of his old justifications. "I was preparing you for a cruel world. Look at what you accomplished. Look at the empire you built. You would have never founded Aegis Nexus if I hadn't pushed you. You owe your success to me. I made you a titan." The sheer, delusional narcissism of his statement hung in the freezing air. Even now, kneeling in the dirt, entirely stripped of his assets, his reputation, and his freedom, he was still trying to claim ownership over my victories. He genuinely believed his cruelty was a gift. "I built my company in spite of you, not because of you," I corrected him, my voice entirely devoid of warmth. "I built it so that I would never, ever have to rely on a manipulative, hypocritical tyrant to survive. And I built it so that I could return the favor." Richard's chest heaved. He looked around wildly, seeing the sheriffs standing coldly by their vehicles, hands resting near their utility belts. He saw the repossession agents securing the chains on his daughter-in-law's car. He realized there were no hidden loopholes left, no crooked lawyers waiting in the wings, and no bank managers he could bribe with a steak dinner. "Victoria, please, I'm an old man," he wailed, his voice rising into a full, humiliating sob. He leaned forward, his palms flat against the gravel, lowering his head until it nearly touched my shoes. "The federal prosecutors are freezing my pension. I have absolutely nothing left. You owe me a place to stay. I gave you life. You cannot just discard me." I stared at the shivering, pathetic shell of Richard Sterling. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittlement, the way he had traded Chloe's financial future to save his own skin, and the sheer arrogance he had displayed in court just yesterday. He wasn't sorry for his crimes. He was only sorry he had been caught. I tilted my head, examining him with the detached curiosity of a scientist looking at a dying specimen under a microscope. "You loved giving me lessons about reality, Richard." My voice cut through his pathetic weeping with absolute clarity. "You loved sitting at the head of the table, dictating how the world worked. Remember the 4th of July barbecue, right before you tried to throw me into a storm? You told me the real world doesn't care about your feelings. You told me that in the real world, weakness is punished and incompetence is evicted. Richard looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute horror. He knew exactly what was coming. They consider this your final lesson, I stated, delivering the words with a crushing, uncompromising finality. In the real world, 62-year-old men who commit fraud don't get to live in $25 million estates. I'll lend you $500 to go rent a U-Haul. Richard let out a sharp gasp, his mouth hanging open in silent, suffocating shock. The absolute finality of my statement hit him like a physical blow. The last tiny ember of hope in his eyes went completely dark, leaving only the grim, terrifying reality of his ruined life. I didn't wait for his response. I turned my head and locked eyes with the lead sheriff standing near the porch. I gave him a brief, decisive nod. "Time's up, Mr. Sterling," the lead deputy shouted, stepping forward with heavy, authoritative strides. 2 large deputies flanked him, heading straight for where my father knelt in the gravel.
"Oh, no, wait," Richard shrieked, his voice fracturing into a hysterical scream as the deputies grabbed his arms roughly. "You can't do this. This is my house. I built this estate. I am Richard Sterling. Get your hands off me."
The deputies lifted his massive frame off the ground with effortless ease. He struggled wildly, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder seams as he desperately tried to break free. His polished leather shoes kicked uselessly at the gravel as they dragged him backward toward the iron gates.
"Victoria, you can't do this. I'm your father."
Richard's howling echoed off the stone facade of the mansion, startling a flock of crows from the bare branches above. I ignored his pleas completely. I turned my back on the chaotic, humiliating spectacle. I walked past Chloe, who was still curled into a miserable ball on the lawn, unable to even lift her head to watch, as her father-in-law was forcibly ejected from the property. I climbed the wide, sweeping stone steps of the mansion. I reached the top of the colonnade and walked through the grand mahogany doors. The massive marble foyer stretched out before me, quiet, pristine, and completely empty. The air inside smelled of expensive wax and absolute silence. I stood in the centre of the grand entryway, letting the deep tranquility of my new home wash over me. Outside, the frantic, desperate screams of Richard Sterling grew fainter and fainter as the sheriffs pushed him past the property line. I reached out and pulled the heavy twin oak doors shut. They closed with a dull, echoing thud, locking the past away forever. 3 months later, the biting winds and cold rain that marked the end of the Sterling Empire had finally yielded to a bright, vibrant California spring. I stood in the center of the sprawling living room of the Etherton estate, adjusting the diamond cuff at my wrist. Across the room, a massive flat-screen television was playing the local evening news. The volume was low, but the bright red, flashing, breaking news banner at the bottom of the screen was impossible to miss. Richard Sterling, the disgraced former venture tycoon, was sitting in the defendant's box wearing an untailored bright orange jumpsuit. The reporter's voice was crisp and objective, stripped entirely of the reverence that used to accompany Richard's name. She was detailing the unsealing of a shocking 90-page federal indictment. The charges included systemic wire fraud, defrauding investors, and interstate financial manipulation. The judge had flagged him as a severe flight risk and denied bail completely. The man who once thought he owned Silicon Valley, who had confidently forged his own family's signatures to feed his endless greed, was now a federal inmate, staring down a mandatory 20-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. The news broadcast transitioned seamlessly to a shaky paparazzi style. Cell phone video of Chloe and Julian leaving a downtown family courthouse. It was a vicious, impoverished spectacle that was almost hard to believe. Chloe was screaming frantically at Julian on a public sidewalk. Her face was entirely stripped of her signature. Flawless makeup and her custom Chanel wardrobe had been replaced by faded generic sweatpants. She was now living in a cramped, 200-square-foot studio apartment above a noisy laundromat in Oakland, barely surviving by trying to sell off her remaining, heavily worn designer shoes on internet auction sites. Julian looked gaunt, terrified, and utterly defeated, clutching a battered pleather briefcase. After his public disgrace and the federal audit of his accounts, he had been blacklisted entirely from the tech community. Infamous and unemployable, he was now working 40 hours a week doing low-level tech support in the back room of an Apple Store Genius bar just to cover his basic rent. Their divorce had turned into a legendary, toxic bloodbath in the local tabloids. There were absolutely no remaining assets to divide, no luxury vehicles to fight over, and no mansions to claim. Instead, they were spending their miserable days frantically battling over who would be legally responsible for the millions of dollars in suffocating debt they had accumulated. They were drowning in the exact financial ruin they had once tried to impose on me. I picked up the silver remote, pressed the power button, and the television screen went black. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I didn't feel a single shred of remorse. They had dug their own graves with their own greed, and now they were lying in them. I turned my attention away from the ghosts of the past and looked toward the vibrant, beating heart of the present. The Atherton estate was completely unrecognizable. Over the past 90 days, I had methodically stripped this mansion of Richard's oppressive, dark, and heavy influence. The suffocating, arrogant oil paintings of old Silicon Valley tech tycoons and the imposing mahogany antiques had been auctioned off or hauled away to a landfill. The walls were now painted in bright, warm, and airy tones. Massive crystal chandeliers illuminated a space that felt full of warmth, life,
and a true sense of purpose.
Tonight was the inaugural gala for the Aegis Nexus Women's Initiative. I had intentionally transformed the ultimate symbol of my father's fragile, toxic ego into a fortress of empowerment. We were raising critical funds to provide immediate legal representation and emergency capital support for women escaping domestic abuse, reproductive coercion, and systemic family financial control. We were helping vulnerable individuals break the chains set by partners who utilized hidden debts, forged signatures, and financial manipulation to control them. We were giving them the exact lifelines, the exact strategic weapons that I had once been forced to forge for myself from scratch. Elijah Vance walked into the room, carrying 2 crystal flutes of vintage champagne. He handed one to me, offering a warm smile of deep respect. "The grand ballroom is completely packed, Victoria," Elijah said, his voice carrying over the beautiful, distant music of a live string quartet. "The mayor has arrived. Several of the Valley's top female founders just walked in, and our initial silent auction has already raised over $4 million. You have completely rewritten the history of this estate in a single evening." I accepted the champagne, offering Elijah a nod of deep gratitude. I walked gracefully through the grand dining room, offering brilliant smiles and respectful nods to the powerful investors, distinguished legal minds, and brave survivors who now had a voice. I was no longer the outcast, pathetic daughter begging for a seat at the table. I owned the table. I was the architect of my own empire. I stepped through the towering French doors and walked out onto the wide marble balcony. A gentle evening breeze brushed against the edges of my silk emerald gown. I looked out over the rolling, perfectly manicured lawns of the estate. This was the exact location where Richard had once tried to break my spirit. And right down there on that gravel driveway, he had fallen to his knees, begging for mercy before being handcuffed and carried away like a spoiled, powerless child. I rested my hands on the cool stone railing and took a slow, incredibly satisfying sip of champagne. Society spends far too much time training women to be quiet peacemakers. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable. We are taught to accept the meager scraps thrown to us by arrogant, privileged men just to keep the family peace. We are expected to absorb their financial betrayals, smile politely at their condescension, and quietly clean up the toxic messes they leave behind. But I learned the ultimate truth the hard way. You don't negotiate with parasites. You don't compromise with people who view you as nothing more than a financial resource to be drained and discarded. You don't argue with toxic individuals who are trying to pull you down. You don't beg for their respect, and you certainly don't wait for their fake apologies. You simply buy the land they are standing on, and then you evict them. You protect your capital. You build your own fortress. You weaponize your intellect, and you strike back with a level of overwhelming, undeniable success until they are completely erased from the equation. Richard and Julian thought they could use my bloodline as a leash to keep me compliant. They thought family obligation would make me turn a blind eye to their ruthless fraud. But true power doesn't come from a bloodline. True power comes from recognizing your absolute self-worth and refusing to discount it for anyone. Behind me, the heavy French doors opened, and the joyous, triumphant sounds of women laughing, networking, and celebrating spilled out onto the balcony. I turned around, leaving the darkness of the lawn behind me forever, and walked back inside to join my true family.
Have you ever had to establish hard, uncompromising financial boundaries with toxic family members to protect your future? Share your story in the comments below, and remember, your financial independence is your ultimate armor.
The story of the downfall of the Atherton estate teaches us a profound lesson. True security is forged through independence, not through toxic bloodlines. For decades, family obligation and financial manipulation were used as weapons to demand blind loyalty and silence. However, the ultimate power comes from recognizing your inherent worth and refusing to compromise with those who only wish to exploit you. Breaking free from emotional and financial abuse takes immense courage to set uncompromising boundaries and the resilience to build your own fortress from scratch. You don't have to inherit your future. You can create it with your own hands.
Have you ever had to draw a line to protect your peace and independence? Share your story and comment below.